On a Saturday morning in October, my grandson stood in the front room of my shop with a microphone in his hand and told 40 of my neighbors that the man who built the place could no longer be trusted to tell time. Then he thanked them all for coming out to the closing sale, and a woman near the door raised her hand and asked him a question he could not answer, which was whose watches were those in the window. I want you to hold on to that question, because it took me 9 weeks and one dead woman's handwriting to be able to answer it out loud. My name is Alvin Rustad. I am 79 years old. For 48 years, I kept a bench on Main Street in Vartal, North Dakota, under a sign that said Rustad Time Service, and for 22 of those years, I was the approved watch inspector for the railroad that ran through the north edge of this town, which meant that once every 2 weeks, a man in a canvas coat set his pocket watch down on my counter, and I told him whether he was allowed to keep his job. Before we go back 9 weeks, humor an old man for 10 seconds. It will make the rest of this easier to tell. Look at whatever clock is nearest to you right this minute. The one on the stove, the one on the wall that has been 3 minutes fast since the last power outage, the one in your hand. Tell me down in the comments what hour it reads, where you are sitting, and tell me honestly whether you trust it. I have spent my whole life around clocks that lie very politely, and I have never once minded knowing what hour I have company in. All right, 9 weeks before that Saturday. You have to understand the room first, because the room is the whole story. The front third was public. A display case that had not had anything worth stealing in it since the middle of the 1980s. A counter of quarter-sawn oak my father set in place the summer he came home from the Pacific, and a wooden captain's chair for whoever wanted to sit and talk while I worked. The back two-thirds was mine, the bench along the north wall, under a window I never covered because north light does not move on you. Cabinets of parts drawers. A machine that talks to a watch and prints out what the watch is really doing instead of what it claims to be doing. And above the bench, screwed into the studs at eye level, a strip of white oak with 14 brass hooks in it, numbered 1 to 14. That rack is the reason there is a story at all, so let me tell you where it came from. My father was an inspector before me, and what he taught me was not the railroad standard. It was the thing underneath it. A watch will behave for an afternoon. Any watch will. A watch cleaned and oiled that morning will sit on your bench and run like a hymn for 6 hours and then go home and start losing 4 minutes a day on a man who is depending on it to keep two trains off the same piece of track. So my father's rule, and then my rule, and it was painted on a card over that rack in my own hand, was this. Nothing leaves this bench until it has kept time for 14 days. Hook 1 on the first day, hook 2 on the second, all the way down the rack, and if it drifts, it comes off the rack and goes back on the bench, and it starts over at hook 1. There was no arguing with it. I have handed a sheriff's deputy back his own watch 4 times before it earned its way down to hook 14, and he stood right there and cussed me both in English and in the Norwegian his mother used, and then he thanked me 9 years later at my wife's funeral. That is who I am. That is all I ever was. A man who would not let a thing out the door until it had proven itself over 14 days. My wife's name was Merritt. She kept the books for the shop for 41 years, and she died 4 years ago in March, on a day so cold that the funeral home apologized for the length of the service. Merritt did not care about watches. Merritt cared about the ticket book. Every single item that came across that counter got a paper ticket, numbered, in a carbon book. Top copy to the customer. Second copy on a steel spike. Description of the item in ink, name, town, date in, and a line at the bottom where I wrote what the person actually wanted, which was usually not what they said. Merritt used to say the ticket book was the only honest thing in the building, because a watch will lie and a man will lie and a wife will lie a little bit around Christmas, but a carbon copy just sits there. 2 years before that October, my hands started going, not the mind, the hands. It runs in families, that fine tremor that gets worse the moment you reach for something. And my mother had it, and at 77 it came for me. I could still handle a mainspring. I could not handle a balance staff, which is a piece of steel about as big around as a hair on your arm. And a man who cannot handle a balance staff has no business charging money to fix a watch. So I called my grandson. His name is Dane. He is 34. His father, my son Peter, died in 2009 on the interstate south of Jamestown, and after that, Dane spent about 15 years being the kind of young man who was always 2 months away from something coming together. I had him in the shop summers when he was a boy. He had good hands. Better than mine ever were, honestly. And I told him so exactly once. because I was raised by people who thought a compliment was a form of spoiling. He came home that spring and stood in the front room with his coat still on, looked at the rack, and said, "Grandpa, does that thing still have the same rule?" I said it does. He said, "Then I guess I better learn to be patient. And there is no point telling any of this if I am going to varnish it, so here it is plain." That was the happiest sentence anybody had said to me since the March Merritt died. 4 years back, right after we buried Merritt, I had done the paperwork to sell him the business. Not give, sell. That distinction is going to matter a great deal later, so let it sit there. I sold Dane the shop on terms. Equipment, benches, machines, the parts, inventory, the name over the door. A small amount down out of his own pocket, and the rest to be paid to me monthly, which some months it was and some months it was not. My lawyer at the time was an old boy named Halvor Brecky, who has since passed, and Halvor did two things that seemed like fussiness to me at the time. The first was that he wrote the sale so that I kept a security interest in everything I had sold, which in plain language means the tools and the machines and the parts were the collateral for the money Dane still owed me. The second was that he filed a piece of paper about it with the Secretary of State in Bismarck, so that anybody in the world who cared to look could see it. I remember standing in his office saying, "Halvor, this is my grandson." And Halvor said, "Alvin, it is not about your grandson. It is about the man your grandson might someday owe money to." I thought he was being a lawyer. I signed it to end the conversation. Then Merritt filed the copy in the green accordion folder she kept the shop papers in, and I did not think about that piece of paper again for 4 years. And I am telling you right now, that piece of paper is the only reason I am not living in a room somebody else picked out for me. So, 9 weeks before that Saturday, it was the middle of August, and it was hot in the way that gets into the tin ceiling and stays there overnight. I came in at 7 like I always did, made coffee in the back, and went to look at the rack, because looking at the rack was how I started every morning of my adult life. 14 hooks. On a normal week, there might be 5 or 6 things hanging there, each with its paper ticket looped through the bow. That morning, there was a gap on hook 9. Hook 9 had held a wristwatch belonging to a woman named Orlean Scar. Her husband Ted ran the elevator scale in Vardal for 31 years, and he died the previous November, and the watch was his. A plain steel thing from about 1962 with a scratched crystal, and it was worth in the neighborhood of $140 on the open market, and it was worth every hour Orlean Scar had left on this earth. She had brought it in and set it on the counter and said, "I do not need it to be pretty. I need it to run, because I would like to hear it at night." I had cleaned it. I had gotten it running with my own bad hands, slowly, over 2 evenings. It went on hook 1 on a Tuesday, and it had climbed to hook 9, and it was doing beautifully, and hook 9 was empty. Now go slow with me here, because this is the stretch where men my age get accused of things. I did not panic. I stood there with a cup of coffee, and I checked the bench, and the drawer, and the little tray where things go when the phone rings. And then I looked at the ticket spike, and the carbon for that watch was not on the spike either. When Dane came in at 9, I asked him about it in the flattest voice I own. He did not even look up from the register. "Oh," he said, "that went out for parts." I said, "Out for parts where?" He said, "There is a guy. Send stuff to a shop in Fargo. They turn it around fast. It is cheaper than us sitting on it for 2 weeks." And here is where I made my first mistake of the 9 weeks, which was that I let it go, because it made a kind of sense. Because I am 79, and my hands shake, and there was a young man in my shop being efficient. And there is a particular flavor of shame that comes over a man when he realizes he is about to become the obstacle. I know what I sound like when I am being the obstacle. My father sounded like that for the last 6 years of his life, and I promised myself I would hear it in my own voice before anybody else had to. So I said, "All right," and went in the back and sat down at the bench and did not do a single useful thing for about an hour. Understand this: half the things on those shelves in the back room never belonged to that shop for one single day. Not one. There were, that August, about 40 items back there that belonged to people in this county. A confirmation watch that a boy named Truett Haugen would get on his 15th birthday. A mantel clock out of the parsonage at Trinity Lutheran that has struck the hour over 3 generations of that congregation's grief. A pocket watch belonging to a man in Devil's Lake whose grandfather carried it in the trenches in France. And then there were a few pieces that had come in on memorandum from a jeweler down in Aberdeen, which is a trade practice where one shop sends another shop goods to show or to work on, and the goods stay the property of the sender the entire time. A repair shop is not a store. A repair shop is a room where you hold other people's property in trust, and then you give it back. That is the whole job. The fixing is just what you do while you are holding it. 2 days later, Hattie Sunday, who kept the books after Merritt and who is 71 and misses nothing, came and stood in the doorway of the back room with a pencil behind her ear. "Alvin," she said, "was that fellow with the rental car supposed to be measuring the back room?" I said, "What fellow?" And she said, "The one who was in here Thursday with Dane, with a laser thing, measuring the shelves and taking pictures of the shelves. I assumed you knew. He asked me how many units were on the shelves, and I told him I do not count them. I ticket them. That night I stayed after closing and emptied the wastebasket out onto the counter, which I am not proud of, and in it there was a shipping label, prepaid, addressed to a company in a town in Nebraska I had never heard of, in a name I had never heard of. I had not packed a single box in 2 years. The man came in person the following Tuesday, which I have since learned is how they do it. They let you find the label. They let you sit with it a few days. Then they walk in the front door smiling, so you will feel foolish for having wondered. His name was Kurt Vanek, 40s, gray quarter-zip sweater, good shoes for a town with gravel alleys, and one of those handshakes that ends before yours does. He put a card on my counter, estate and inventory recovery, and under that, unlocking dormant value for family enterprises. I asked him what dormant value was. He smiled like I had said something charming and said, "Mr. Rustad, dormant value is anything sitting still that could be sitting in a bank." Then he talked for 11 minutes without once saying a sentence I could have repeated back. Legacy transition. The current market for vintage timepieces being historically strong. How a family business at generational handover is at its most vulnerable. And how his firm specialized in what he called a dignified exit. He said the word dignified 4 times. And every so often he glanced at Dane, who stood behind the register looking at the floor like a boy told to stay in the room while the adults talk. I said, "Mr. Vanek, about half the property in this building is not ours." He said, "Absolutely, and we account for all of that." I said, "How?" And he said, "We have a process." Now, I did what the man I used to be would have done. I got hot. I am saying so on purpose, because I have listened to a lot of these stories where the old man is calm from the first minute, and that is not how it went in my shop. That evening after Vanek left, I went at my grandson in the back room with my finger in the air, and I said things about his father, which I should not have done, because Peter was dead and could not defend how he raised the boy. And Dane did not yell back. That is what I was not ready for. He got very quiet and very kind, which is 1,000 times worse. "Grandpa," he said, "you told me to handle it. In June, we sat right there and you said you were tired and to handle it. You do not remember, and that is okay, but you told me. I stood in my own shop with my mouth open. I did not remember any such conversation, but I also did not remember what I ate at the Legion on the 4th of July, or the name of Orlean Scar's sister when I ran into her at the Senex. And once you are 79, every hole in your day gets weighed on a different scale. I went home that night and sat in the kitchen with the light off and asked myself the question, am I the problem? Is this the thing where the old man is the last one to know? That is the trap. And I want to say it plainly for anybody who is somewhere in the middle of it right now. They do not have to convince the county that you are slipping. They only have to convince you. A man who is not sure of himself signs things. A man who is not sure of himself apologizes and stops asking. August was not the theft. August was the softening. By the end of that week, Dane had told Hattie, in a low voice, in a tone of great sadness, that he was worried about me. He told her I had given a watch away to a customer for free, which I had. It was the Haugen boy's confirmation watch, and the ticket said no charge, because I had known his grandfather since we were both 19 and standing in the same line at the induction center in Fargo. He told her I had wandered in one Sunday when we were closed, which I had, because it was Marit's birthday, and I wanted to sit in the chair she used to sit in, and I did not feel like explaining that to anyone. Do you see the shape of it? Every single thing he told her was true. Not one of them was honest. That is a distinction they do not teach you until you are old enough to have it used on you. The turn came on the last Thursday in August, and it came because of the ticket book, which means it came because of Marit. I could not sleep. Around 4 in the morning, I got up and drove down to the shop, which is a 9-minute drive I could make with my eyes closed. And I let myself in and turned on the bench light, and I took the ticket spike off the wall, and I went through it, one at a time. 400 and some carbons, oldest at the bottom, and I found three things. The first was that 11 tickets were missing out of the sequence, not torn out sloppy, removed clean, so the numbers just skipped, the way a man skips a number when he thinks nobody in the world is ever going to add them up. The second was that on 4 other tickets, in the box where the item's owner goes, somebody had gone over my ink with a different pen and changed the word from a person's name to the word shop. The third one is the one I had to sit down for. The mantel clock from the parsonage at Trinity Lutheran, which is not ours, which has never been ours, which belongs to a congregation of 206 people, had a ticket in that spike with a small pencil notation in the corner in handwriting that was not mine and not Merritt's. It said Lot 41. Somebody had already put a lot number on a church's clock. I said nothing to him about it. That was not wisdom. That was arithmetic. I had a pencil mark and a feeling, and he had a story about a June conversation, and I knew exactly how that would go if I brought it to anybody. So I did what I did for a living. I stopped trying to know, and I started trying to record. I bought a spiral notebook at the drugstore for $1 and something, and I wrote on the front of it the word bench, so that if anybody picked it up, it would look like shop notes. And starting that Friday, I wrote down the date, the hour, and the plain fact. Not what I thought about the fact, just the fact. Hook, 9. Empty. Ticket numbers absent. Rental car plate. Words used in quotation marks, as close to exact as I could get them within the hour. I also did something that sounds strange unless you have done my work. I ran a test on myself. The federal government broadcasts a time signal on the radio out of Colorado. It has done it my entire working life. It is the same signal I set my master clock by every morning for 48 years. So I started a card. The same kind of card I would start for any watch that came across the counter, except the name on the top line was mine. Every morning at the same minute I would write down what my own wall clock read against the signal, and then I would write down 3 other things: what day of the week it was, what I had eaten the night before, and what the last thing was that I had told a customer. 14 days. Hook 1 to hook 14. I did it because if my mind was going, I wanted to be the one who found it, and I wanted to find it in writing, on a card, in my own hand, with dates. And I did it because if my mind was fine, then I was going to need to prove that to somebody in a room I had never been in before. And I have never in my life met a jury of any kind that was more persuaded by a man's opinion of himself than by 14 days of written record. 14 days later, my own card was clean. Not one drift. I would like to tell you that felt good. What it actually felt like was worse, because it meant every single thing that had happened was on purpose. I called a lawyer in Valley City. Her name is Ione Brecka, and yes, she is old Halvor's daughter, which I did not know until I was sitting in her office, looking at a photograph on the wall of a man I had signed papers with in 1994. She does elder law, which is a phrase I had heard my whole life and had always understood to mean law for other people. She let me talk for a full 20 minutes without interrupting me once. Then she asked me 3 questions. She asked whether I had ever signed a power of attorney naming Dane. I had not. Merritt and I had named each other. And after Merritt, I had never gotten around to it, which turned out to be the luckiest laziness of my life. Then she asked whether I still owned the building. I said, I own the building, and I lease it to the business for $1 a year, which Halvor also set up, and which I also thought at the time was fussiness. She put her pen down and she said, Mr. Rustad, I need you to hear the next part very carefully, because it is going to be tempting to feel relieved, and this is not the time for that. You have not been robbed of a watch. Somebody is preparing to sell the contents of a building he does not own, on a lease he cannot break, containing property that mostly belongs to other people. Nobody does that unless they believe you are about to stop being able to object. I said, and how would a person arrange for me to stop being able to object? And she said, in this state, they would go to district court. 9 days later, the certified letter came. I signed for it at the counter at the post office because Vardal is small enough that the mail does not come to the shop until after 10, and I was not going to wait. Vada, behind the counter, watched me open it, which I did not intend to do standing up. It was a petition. filed in the district court for our county. It asked the court to appoint a guardian for my person and a conservator for my estate. In that petition, I was not Alvin Rustad. I was the proposed ward. I have been called some things in 79 years. Nothing has ever landed on me like the word proposed. The petition said I was 79 years old and suffered from a progressive tremor, which is true. It said I had given away shop merchandise without payment, which is technically true and completely false. It said I had been found in the business premises at unusual hours, which is true, and it did not mention my wife's birthday. It said I had become resistant and suspicious about routine business decisions, which is the single most useful sentence in the document, because that sentence means that the more accurately I understood what was happening, the sicker I was going to look, and at the bottom, as the interested party bringing it, was my grandson's name, in the same handwriting he used to sign his school papers when he was a boy at my kitchen table. The hearing was set for the middle of October. The closing sale, I would find out about 11 days later, was set for the Saturday before it. They were going to empty the building first and let the court sort out the old man afterward. I drove to Valley City with the petition on the seat beside me, and Ione Brecky read it twice, and the second time she smiled, which made me want to put my hat back on and leave. She said, "I am not smiling because it is funny. I am smiling because whoever wrote this has never taken one of these all the way through in this state." Then she taught me my own state, which is a humbling thing, at 79. In North Dakota, there is no separate probate court sitting off in its own little building. It is all district court, the same court that handles a divorce and a grain contract and a boy who put his truck through the front of the hardware store. Guardianship and conservatorship both live in the same title of the code, and the two words are not the same word. A guardian is over the person, where you live, what doctor you see, whether you may drive to the shop at 4 in the morning on your dead wife's birthday. A conservator is over the estate, your money, your building, your machines, your signature. They had asked for both. But here is the part that made her smile, and here is the part I want anybody watching this to write down somewhere, because there is a whole industry that is counting on you not knowing it. In this state, when somebody petitions to have you declared incapacitated, the court does not take their word and hand them a stamp. The court appoints you a lawyer, whether you want one or not. It appoints a guardian ad litem, whose only job is to report to the judge what is actually in your interest, and not what is in anybody's convenience. And it appoints an expert examiner to evaluate you. Ione said. They filed this, thinking the paperwork was the weapon. The paperwork is the invitation. They have just invited 3 professionals who do not work for them to come look at you, I said. And what if they look at me and see an old man with shaking hands? She said. Then bring them 14 days of your own handwriting. Now, I want to slow down here, because if I make this sound like it turned into a chess game that afternoon, I will have told it wrong. That September was the worst month of my life, and I have buried a wife and a son. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes with being the subject of a document. Everywhere I went, I did not know who had read it. 2 men I have had coffee with since the Johnson administration stopped bringing up the shop, which is the only thing we have ever talked about. Somebody I never identified called the county about me, and a very decent young woman sat in my kitchen for 40 minutes and asked whether I was eating and whether I felt safe, and I answered every question cheerfully and then closed the door behind her and put my forehead against it. And the hardest part has to be said out loud, because somebody listening needs to hear that this part is normal. The hardest part was not that he was stealing from me. The hardest part was that I still wanted him to come by. He was all I had left of Peter. When Dane laughed, he did it with his shoulders the way his father did. And every single time it happened, it cost me something. There was one evening in the middle of all this when he stopped in the shop just before close, and he had a bag from the drive-in, and he set a burger down on my bench, and we ate together and talked about a fishing trip we took to Devil's Lake when he was 11, and I laughed so hard at one point that I had to take my glasses off. And the whole time, in the back of my head, a small voice was saying, "He has a lot number on the church's clock." You can love somebody and be building a file on him at the same time. Nobody tells you that. It does not feel noble. It feels like being 2 men in one coat. Ione's advice was the hardest instruction I have ever followed, and it was 3 words. Let him win. She said, do not confront him. Do not warn him. Do not fix it for him. Every time you correct a man in the middle of a scheme, you teach him what you know and you give him time to move it. He is going to keep doing what he is doing. and every additional thing he does is another line on a page in front of a judge. So I got quiet, and they read it exactly the way she said they would. Within 2 weeks, Dane stopped hiding things. He took calls in the front room with the door to the back standing open. He put a whiteboard behind the register with dates on it. He talked to Vanek on speaker while I stood 11 feet away wiping down a case because I had become furniture. And on the 26th of September, a Friday, at about 4 in the afternoon, I was in the back, sorting a drawer of crown taps, when I heard my grandson say into the telephone, in a completely ordinary voice, the sentence that opened the whole thing up. He said, "No. The equipment is fine. The equipment is already pledged. I did that in July. Pledged." Now, that is not a word a young man in a repair shop uses by accident. That is a word a lender teaches you. Ione had a young man in her office run a search that Monday. It is not detective work, and it is not a database anybody had to sneak into. In this state, when somebody borrows money against business property, the lender files a notice with the Secretary of State. That filing is public. Any citizen can look it up, and it costs about what a tank of gas costs. What came back was 2 pages, and I read them standing up in her waiting room. In July, my grandson had signed a security agreement pledging all inventory, equipment, fixtures, and accounts of Rustad time service as collateral for a personal loan of $91,000 from a lender in Sioux Falls, not a bank. One of these outfits that advertises on the radio between the farm report and the noon news. And in the middle of August, 4 days after Hattie saw the man with the laser measure, he had signed a liquidation and consignment agreement with Vanek's firm covering, and I am quoting the paper, the entire contents of the premises. The entire contents of the premises. 40 items on those shelves belonging to people in this county. A church's clock. A dead man's watch that a widow wanted to hear at night. Goods sitting there on memorandum from a jeweler in Aberdeen who had trusted a name over a door since before my grandson was born. All of it, every single piece, was inside the phrase, the entire contents of the premises, and there was a schedule attached with lot numbers going up past 60, and lot 41 was the parsonage clock. I asked Ione the only question I could form. I said, "Can he do that?" And she said, "He can sign it." Whether it means anything is a different question, and the answer to that question was decided in 1994 by a man you thought was being fussy. Before I tell you what she found next, one interruption, and it is the last one. If you are still riding along with me, and you have sat in a room like the one I have been describing, or you are afraid you are going to, go ahead and subscribe. Not on my account. Do it so the next man my age who sits down and tells the truth about his own family finds a room that is not empty. Because here is what she found. That piece of paper Halverbreche filed in 1994, when I sold my grandson the shop, was not a keepsake. Under the law that governs this everywhere in this country, a filing like that has a life of 5 years, and then it dies, unless somebody files a continuation. And there is only one window in which a continuation may be filed, and that window is the 6 months right before it lapses. Miss it, and the filing is dead, and you go to the back of the line behind whoever filed next. Ione had her young man pull the whole filing history. There was the original. Then, in 2019, a continuation. And then, in 2024, a second continuation, filed in the 6-month window on the 11th of January. Merritt died on the 2nd of March, 2024. She filed it 7 weeks before she died, out of a hospital bed in Fargo, with a form she had asked her sister to bring her and a check she wrote in handwriting that was already going bad. Because she had a green accordion folder and a calendar in it. And every 5 years she had a note on that calendar, and she was not about to be the reason a thing lapsed. Ione slid the copy across the desk to me and did me the great courtesy of leaving the room for a minute. That signature is the last thing my wife wrote that was not on a card to a grandchild. And what it meant in the flat language of the thing was that my claim on every machine and every bench and every parts cabinet in that building had been standing in line since 1994, and the lender from Sioux Falls had gotten into that line in July. 29 years, and change behind a woman who did the paperwork on time. First in line is first in line. It is not a moral principle. It does not care who deserves what. It is a rule about dates, and dates do not have feelings. And my wife knew that about dates because she kept the ticket book for 41 years. I sat in that office, and I did not cry about the money. I did not care about the money by then. I cried because for 4 years I had been going home to a house where the only thing that ever changed was the light, and it turned out she had not entirely stopped taking care of me. She had just done it in advance. You want to know what a living wife does. That is what a living wife does. She reads the small print in January and dies in March and saves you in October. Ione came back in and sat down, and she was all business again, which I was grateful for. She said, "Mr. Rustad, now we have a decision to make, and it is yours, and I want you to take a night with it." I said, "What is the decision?" She said, "I can stop this on Wednesday. I can send letters. The sale does not happen. The lender learns what it bought, and it all ends quietly in offices, and nobody in Vardal ever knows a thing about it." I said, "Or," and she said, "Or, you let it happen." I took the night. I sat at the kitchen table with the light off, which is apparently where I do my thinking now, and I turned it over until about 2 in the morning. Here is what decided it, and it was not anger. If Ione sent her letters on Wednesday, then Orleans Scar would never know that her husband's watch had been given a lot number. The congregation at Trinity Lutheran would never know that their clock had been listed as an asset of a business it had never belonged to. Truett Haugen's mother would never know why the confirmation watch was 3 weeks late. They would all just quietly get their property back and go on liking my grandson, who they have known since he was in the Christmas program. And Kurt Vanek would get in his rental car and drive to the next town with a 200-year-old Main Street and a shop with an old name over the door and a young man in it who owed somebody money. That was the whole calculation. Not 1 minute of it was about wanting anybody to be humiliated. I have been alive long enough to know that humiliation is a fire you light in your own house. But there is a difference between punishing a man and refusing to be quiet on his behalf. I had been quiet on that boy's behalf since he was 19 years old, and every year the quiet got more expensive, and the bill was now being sent to a widow and a church. So I called Ione at 8 in the morning, and I said, "We let it happen, but we do it my way, and my way has rules. Rule 1. Nobody's property gets sold. Not one item. Not for 1 minute. Rule 2. No sheriff at the door, no handcuffs in front of the newspaper, no arrest in that building. That building has my father's counter in it. Rule 3. When it is over, the boy gets a door. Not forgiveness. A door." She said, "I can work with all three of those." And then she went to work, and I want to walk you through exactly what she did, because there was nothing clever in it. It was all just the ordinary machinery that is sitting there available to any citizen who knows the names of the parts. First, she sent a written notice to the lender in Sioux Falls, with a copy of the filing history, informing them that their collateral was subject to a prior perfected interest of record from 1994. That is not an accusation, that is a courtesy. A lender who receives that letter goes and looks, and what they see is that they lent $91,000 against a pile of machinery they are standing behind an old man to get to. Second, she sent a notice to Vanek's firm and, more importantly, to the surety company that bonds them, because an outfit that sells other people's goods carries a bond, and a bonding company that gets a letter about property held in bailment does not sleep well. She attached a list. 40 items, owner names, ticket numbers, and the date each one came across my counter. Third, she wrote the jeweler in Aberdeen whose goods were on memorandum, and that man called me within the hour, so angry on my behalf that I had to talk him out of driving up. Fourth, and this is the one that mattered, she wrote to the court, not to fight the petition, to welcome it. She filed a response stating that I did not oppose an evaluation, that I would cooperate fully with the examiner and the guardian ad litem, and that I requested the evaluation be scheduled at the earliest possible date. She told me later that this ends these faster than anything else, and that almost nobody does it, because when a man is accused of losing his mind, his instinct is to refuse to be examined, and refusal reads on paper exactly like fear. I did the fifth thing myself, at my own counter, with a box of postcards from the drugstore, 40 of them, one for every item on those shelves, written out by hand over 3 evenings, each saying the same thing in about the same words. Your property is finished and it is ready. The shop will be open Saturday morning the 11th from 9 o'clock. Please bring your ticket stub. There is no charge on this one. Alvin. I mailed them on the Tuesday. Then I stood in front of the rack and did the only sentimental thing I did in the whole 9 weeks. I took down the card with my father's rule painted on it and put it in my coat pocket, because whatever happened in that room on Saturday, I did not want that card hanging on the wall behind it. On Thursday, the Chamber of Commerce put a notice in the Vartal Weekly Sentinel, a ribbon at 10 o'clock, coffee and bars. The paper was sending somebody. The headline said, "A Main Street landmark begins its next chapter." My grandson had scheduled his own celebration, invited the whole town to it, and told the newspaper what time to be there. The examiner came on the Wednesday. A physician's assistant out of the clinic in Jamestown, mid-30s, very serious, and she was in my kitchen for 2 hours and 10 minutes. She asked the questions they ask. What year it is. Remember these 3 words. I will ask you again in a while. Count backward. Draw a clock face showing 10 past 11, which I found personally insulting, and which I did anyway, correctly, without saying one single smart thing about it, and that took everything I had. Then she asked to see the books, and I gave her Hattie's ledger, my notebook, and my 14-day card. She looked at that card a long time. She said, "Explain this to me." So I explained the rack. 14 hooks. Nothing leaves the bench until it has kept time for 14 days. And I said, when the paperwork came saying my mind was going, I did not know how to argue about a thing like that, so I put myself on the rack. She wrote for a while without saying anything. Then she said, "Mr. Rustad, I am not permitted to tell you what I am going to report, but I would like to ask you a question that is not on my form." I said, "Go ahead." She said, "If you knew in August, why did you not throw him out of the building in August?" And I said, "Because in August all I had was a feeling. And in this county, a feeling gets an old man, a nice room with a rail on the bed." The guardian ad litem came the next day, and he was a lawyer out of Carrington, gray-haired, and he had already been to the shop and already talked to Hattie Sunday, and I could tell within 4 minutes that he had made up his mind before he ever came up my steps, because the first thing he asked me was not about my memory. It was, sir, who currently holds a security interest in the equipment in that building. Somebody had done the reading. And then on Friday evening, the night before, my grandson came to my house. He had not been to my house since June. He stood on the porch with his hands in his jacket and he would not come in. And he told me that tomorrow was going to be a good thing, that it was time, that Vanek's people would handle everything, and that afterward there would be enough to clear everything up and start something new. And he used the word clean about 6 times. And I looked at him standing under my porch light and I saw something I had not let myself see for 9 weeks, which is that he was terrified. So I asked him one question, and it was the only question I asked him that entire fall. I said, "Dane, how much of that 91,000 is still yours?" He did not answer for a long time. And then he said, in a voice about 11 years old, "None of it." And there it was. He had gone to a lender because he was behind on the shop's terms and on some cards, and the money had come in and gone right back out again to satisfy an earlier obligation that Vanek's outfit had helped arrange in the spring. The fee on the liquidation agreement grew if the total came in over a certain number, which is exactly the arrangement that makes a man start adding other people's property to his own inventory. My grandson had not woken up one morning and decided to sell a church's clock. He had signed one thing in April that he did not read, and every single thing after that was somebody handing him the next paper and telling him it was the only way out. That does not make him innocent. He put a pencil mark on Trinity Lutheran's clock with his own hand, and he wrote my name in a petition and called me incapable in a public record so that the sale would go through without an objection. A frightened man is still the man who did it. I have never once in my life accepted fear as a receipt. But the shape of the thing has to be told straight, because one telling of this makes my grandson a monster, and that version would go down easier and it would be a lie, and I have never had any use for a watch that reads pretty and runs wrong. I said, "Go home and get some sleep." He said, "Grandpa, will you be there tomorrow?" And I said, "I have opened that door at 7 o'clock every Saturday for 48 years. Then I went in and shut the door, and I got about as much sleep as he did. Saturday, the 11th of October, was clear and about 40 degrees, with the hard blue sky we get here when the wind finally quits for a day. I opened the door at 7 and made the coffee in the back the way I always did. At 8, Vanek's crew arrived in a box truck and started setting up folding tables in the front room, and they put a sign on an easel by the door, and they ran a red ribbon across the entry on 2 stanchions the chamber keeps in a closet at the city hall. At 8:45, people started coming, and they came with postcards in their hands. Orlean Scar was first, because Orleans Scar has been first to everything in this town since 1958. Then Truett Haugen and his mother. Then two trustees from Trinity Lutheran in their jackets, because a church does not send one man to get its clock. Then a fellow who drove up from Devil's Lake with his grandfather's pocket watch stub in a plastic sleeve. By 9:30, there were about 40 of them in a room built for 11, and the crew from the box truck had quit setting up tables and stood along the wall, trying to figure out what kind of a town this was. At 10 o'clock, my grandson picked up the microphone. I want to tell you that he did it cruelly. He did not. He read it. He had it written on an index card and his hands were shaking worse than mine. And he said that after 48 years, Rustad Time Service was entering a new chapter, and he thanked everybody for coming. Then he read the line somebody else had written for him, and that line has been in my head every day since. He said, "As many of you know, my grandfather is no longer able to keep up with the demands of the bench, and this decision has been made with his care in mind." The room did not gasp. This is North Dakota. The room got quiet in a way that a stranger would mistake for agreement. And then Orleans Scar, 76 years old, 4'11", said, from the second row, in a voice like a screen door, "Dane, whose watches are those in the window?" Now I have to introduce you to a woman named Farrell Dunbar, who was not a hero, did not know one of us, and was simply a professional doing her job correctly, which turns out to be the same thing. She was the field manager for the liquidation crew. A bonded firm cannot conduct a sale of business assets without running a lien search, and their surety had gotten a letter on Tuesday, so Farrell Dunbar had a folder in her hand and a job to protect. She stepped forward and said, "Before we begin," then she asked the flattest, most ordinary administrative question I have ever heard in my life. She said, "I need to identify the secured party of record on the equipment. Filing shows a continuation. Who is Rustad?" The room turned around and looked at me. I was standing at my own counter with my hands on the oak where I have stood for 48 years, and I said, "That would be me and my wife." Vanek came off the wall fast then and started talking about a schedule and a timeline and how these matters get resolved after the sale. And Farrell Dunbar, who I would hire in a minute, said, "Sir, we do not sell into a prior perfected interest," and turned her back on him. That was the whole reversal. No shouting. Nobody arrested in my father's front room. A woman in a canvas coat read a line off a public filing and asked who somebody was. But that was only the first half, and the first half was about machinery, and I never cared about machinery. I lifted the hinged section of the counter, went to the back, and carried out the ticket spike and the shelf trays. Then I stood at my father's oak and did the one thing I have ever truly known how to do. I called out a ticket number and a name. Orleans Scar came up and put her stub on the counter, and I put Ted's watch in her hand, and I told her it was running 4 seconds fast in 14 days, and that if it ever bothered her, she should bring it back. She held it up to her ear, right there in front of everybody, and then she sat down in the captain's chair and did not get up for a while. Truett Haugen. The trustees, both of them, one on each side of that mantel clock, carrying it out the front door under the ribbon like pallbearers. The man from Devil's Lake, Hattie Sunday's own kitchen clock, which had been on hook 3, 40 items. It took 40 minutes. And when it was done, the entire contents of the premises consisted of some folding tables that did not belong to us, a display case with nothing worth stealing in it since the middle of the 1980s, and my father's counter, which was not for sale in 1951, and is not for sale now. The auction emptied itself, in public, in silence, into the hands of the people it belonged to. Kurt Vanek left before the last 4 tickets were called. Nobody stopped him. Nobody said anything to him at all, which around here is the strongest thing that can be said to a man. The petition was dismissed 11 days later, and I was not in the room when it happened. Ione told me afterward that it took about 4 minutes. The examiner's report was in the file, and the guardian ad litem's report was in the file, and my grandson's own attorney, who I understand had been retained by somebody else and had recently learned that, moved to withdraw the petition, and the judge dismissed it with prejudice, which means it cannot be brought again on the same facts. Then the court went on to the next matter, which I believe involved offense. There is no music when that happens. Nobody says a word about dignity. A clerk stamps a page. The lender in Sioux Falls is pursuing my grandson personally for the rest of it, which is the correct outcome, and I did not lift one finger to stop it. He signed that. He is 34 years old. Vanek's firm is another matter. The consumer protection people in this state take an interest in outfits that arrange to sell property held in bailment, and the surety company took an interest in Vanek personally, and the jeweler in Aberdeen took the kind of interest that costs a man his standing in a small trade. I gave one statement, in an office, for 2 hours, and answered exactly what I was asked and volunteered nothing, and then I went home. I did not press charges against my grandson. Let me say why. Because it was not mercy, and it was not weakness. I had already gotten every single thing I actually wanted by 10:40 on a Saturday morning. Orlean Scar can hear her husband at night. Trinity Lutheran strikes the hour. My name is not in a court file as a proposed anything. There was nothing left in the box for a prosecutor to hand me except the sight of a boy who looks like my son being walked out of a building, and I do not want that. Not on my last few thousand mornings. So I gave him the door instead, and the door has terms, and here is what they are. He is at the bench Tuesday through Saturday. He does not touch the register, and he does not touch the ticket book. He works off what he owes the Aberdeen shop first, before $1 goes to Sioux Falls and before $1 comes to me, because the people who trusted you on a handshake stand at the front of that line. Ione wrote it out. He signed it. And this time he read every word of it out loud in front of me, which was my requirement. And that piece of paper is not in a file cabinet. I took my father's card back out of my coat pocket, and I hung it over the rack where it has always been. And then I folded my grandson's promise, and I hung it on hook 1. I move it 1 hook a day. If he drifts, it comes down and it starts over at hook 1, and he knows it. And the first time it happened, in November, he did not argue with me. He came in the next morning and hung it back up himself and did not say a word about it, which is how I knew something in him had finally been taken apart and cleaned. We do not talk about that fall. We talk about the work. Some things get fixed in the talking and some get fixed in 800 hours of 2 men sitting near each other under a north window, and I have always been the second kind. Saturday mornings now, from 9 to noon, the front room is open and there is no charge. 2 high school kids come, a girl named Britt, who has better hands than anybody I have taught in 20 years, and a boy who is mostly there for the coffee and bars, and I let them both stay. Half the time, it is a dead battery, and I will not take $1 for it. Hattie Sunday makes them sign the ticket book anyway, because Hattie learned from Merritt, and Merritt did not care about watches, and if nothing else from this hour stays with you, keep these 4. When you hand your property to somebody to hold or fix or store or sell, get a paper with your name on it and keep it, because possession and ownership are 2 different animals, and they look alike from the sidewalk. If you own a business, or sold one to somebody you love, go find out what has been filed against it. That is public, it is cheap, and it will take you a morning. If a stranger uses the word dignified about your exit, put your hat on. And if papers ever come to your door with your own name on them, and the word proposed in front of it, do not be too proud to be examined, and do not go in alone. Talk to a lawyer who does this, not your nephew who does closings, one who does this. I will not tell you what the law is where you live. I do not know where you live, and any man who says he does is selling something. Here is what I know. They will tell you that a watch that runs fast is broken. It is not. A watch that runs fast has had somebody's hand on the regulator, and it will go right on, keeping perfect time for whoever moved it. That is the part nobody wants to hear. It is not sick. It is obedient. It is doing precisely what it was set to do by the last person who touched it. You do not get that back with an argument. You get it back the same way you get anything back. You put it where the light does not move on you, and you write down what it actually does, 1 day at a time, and you do not let it out the door until it has earned the 14th hook. My name is Alvin Rustad. The shop opens at 7.